Nelson Mandela once said, and I quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world," unquote. In 2013 and 14, the net enrollment rate in primary education in India was 88%. It is an impressive number, but what about the quality of education? According to a recent report, 60% of Class 3 children are unable to read Class 1 level textbooks. Despite such stark figures, the Indian government allocates just 0.5% of the GDP to the education sector. So how do these low levels of allocation impact our country and its education? This and more we will discuss with our experts. Parth Shah, President and founder of the Centre of Civil Society, and Meeta Sen Gupta, Centre for Education Strategy, who joins me here at the WION headquarters in New Delhi. Now, what are the policies rolled out by the government for the education sector? How much money has been allocated to each of these policies that we're talking about? All these questions are answered by our correspondent Shilpika with this story. Take a look.
Education was listed as one of the 9 pillars of the Union Budget 2016-17. The Finance Minister announced an allocation of $10.6 billion, which is almost 5% higher than the allocation for education in FY 2015-16. In this budget, $6.4 billion were allocated to school education and $4.2 billion were allocated to higher education. Key plans of the Union Budget 2016-17 for education sector were 10 public and 10 private world-class educational institutions, $73.4 million for promoting entrepreneurship among scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, digital repository for all school leaving certificates and diplomas, $150 million for higher education and $250 million for 1,500 multi-skill development centers, 62 new Navodaya Vidyalayas to provide quality education, digital literacy scheme for covering 6 crore additional rural households, skill 10 million youth in the next 3 years entrepreneurship training to be provided across schools, colleges and massive online courses, increased focus on quality of education. Overall, the budget plan for the sector appeared promising, especially riding on 100% FDI in education sector and RTE. However, there are a few serious issues plaguing the education sector in India that disrupt even the best of the plans. Expenses on education as a percentage of the GDP is as low as 0.5%. Capacity utilization is another challenge. The capacity utilization in case of MBA is about 57% in Maharashtra and 72% in Haryana. The student-teacher ratio is disturbingly high. In developed countries, this ratio stands at 11.4. In case of India, it is as high as 22.0. It is even low in Western Asia, which is 15.3, and Latin America, which is 16.6. This brings the necessity to recruit quality teachers and strengthen the teachers required to handle classes. Gross enrollment ratio, or the number of students enrolled in school at several different grade levels, is still a big challenge. Though, as per the union government, the current GER is 23.6%, which is almost double of 12% witnessed in 2010, it is not a pleasant number. Keeping these major challenges in mind, the outcome of the Union Budget 2017-18 is yet to be seen. Bureau Report, WION.
Well, that was Shilpika painting the lay of the land as far as the education sector in India is concerned and summing up really for us all that the government has done until now. Now, I'm joined by Meeta Sen Gupta, the founder for Centre for Education Strategy, in the studio at the WION headquarters. And very shortly, we will also be joined by Parth Shah, the founder and president of Centre for Civil Society, in just about a bit in this show. We're going to start off with Meeta, who's right here in the studio with me. Meeta, we just saw the package. Every year, the government is rolling out new initiatives and measures and schemes to make sure that we're upping the ante as far as the education sector in India is concerned. But still, reports and research reports which are coming out are painting a very gloomy picture for the education sector in India. Where are we really going wrong as a country? What has the government not been able to do, and have they not been able to really nail the coffin as far as closing it once and for all and finding out a solution for the sector is concerned?
Nail the coffin was a very interesting way of putting it, because for the longest time we've been talking about the demographic dividend and fearing that the demographic dividend will go wrong if we are not able to capture enough variables, we're not able to capture enough children and grow them into employability. Now, employability is obviously not necessarily the only goal of every education policy, nor of every education budget, but at this point of time, when we have 5 million children coming into education every year, we need to make sure that they are all able to fend for themselves in the world. Now, a couple of things. You said that we have been investing more and more in education every year. Yes, we have been investing more and more in education in nominal terms. We increase it from, say, 3 to 3.5% of the GDP, but the ask has always been 6% of the GDP. We need investment in education to be doubled. We need more investment. We need smarter investment. The other thing that you talked about was we've been doing so much in education, and yet we come up with similar dismal results. Well, if you continue to do the same old things, you're going to get the same old results.
Sure.
We need to work radically towards a completely different education paradigm, which is why for the longest time we've been calling for grassroots engagement in the new education policy. And we've been asking for a relook at the way India manages its education. A simple tinkering around the edges with a few bits and pieces of budget improvements or something that gets aggregated on the sides is just not going to cut it.
Sure. So very well put out by Meeta indeed, that we need radical changes coming in the education system. The change that the government really brings in needs to be disruptive in India, otherwise we're caught in the same paradigm time and again, year after year. We're also being joined by Parth Shah, who's the founder and president for Centre for Civil Society, with us live on the show. Now, Parth, in 2012, the government enacted the Right to Education Act, almost terming it as the act will solve all the problems that the education sector is facing at this point of time. Are we able to implement what all has been listed and mandated by the Act effectively?
As you said, this right, the Act was intended to solve many of the India's education problems. Unfortunately, I think for us and for our children, the Act did not talk at all about learning outcomes. So in some ways, Act focused on challenges of the past as opposed to the challenges of the future, right? And the Act focused largely on the infrastructure, teacher qualifications, classroom size, size of the plot on which schools must be built, number of books a library must have. So it focused all on the inputs and nothing really much about the learning achievements of students. So if you think about it, it was more like an industrial age effort in the information age that we are living in. So it did not really gel, did not solve the challenges that we face today in any meaningful way.
Right, Parth. A very interesting point brought out by you indeed. He's talking about a lot of input being there, but not much learning really taking place. Meeta, why is it that the education sector today is being unable to provide the right kind of learning and the skill set building that is required for this country? I mean, India is known to produce so many doctors and engineers, and there was a time we were talking about brain drain as well. But you know, it is the grassroots level of primary and secondary education that we're talking about, which is not being given importance. It is about the rural areas that really need penetration in terms of education institutions as well. Any kind of schemes that the government needs to come up with to ensure that the Indians and the common man is educated in this country. In a developing nation going on to become a developed one. How is it even possible without education?
Absolutely, well said. It's not going to become a developed nation without education. But again, coming back to the RTE Act, we used to in fact joke about it, saying that this is a Right to Infrastructure Act and rather than a Right to Education Act. Education has to be defined by learning outcomes. Education has to be defined by the output and the process of education, and so far that has not been done at all. If you measure teachers merely by the fact that they are employed to land up in school and there are absolutely no penalties for not being actually present in school when they're supposed to be there, then there is very little teaching and learning happening. At one point of time, in fact, the estimate was that on a particular given day, about 60% of teachers in, I think it was the state of UP, a study done by Professor Geeta Kington, 60% of teachers were not present at school. So if you physically have no teaching happening at schools, then you are not going to see learning outcomes. You're not going to see things change. Things have improved, definitely. We are able to track teachers better, and there are some interesting things happening in managing classroom sessions. In fact, I would very interestingly say that Delhi State has thrown a challenge to the rest of the nation by upping its investment in education and focusing dramatically on teacher training
I'm glad
and
you brought up
student
the
learning.
point about investment as well. I'm going to go to Parth over in just about a bit to talk to him about the enrollment issues that we're facing as well. But before that, you spoke about investment. It also brings us to the outlay that we require overall in the education sector. What would your expectation be in terms of an overall education outlay that will help us resolve this crisis that the country is facing, and some sort of a reformative measure which is being brought in by the union budget this time?
Interesting you should say that. Like I said, the ask, and this is where developed nations have been at when they were able to up the ante in this one, was 6%, which is at least double of what we are spending right now.
Sure.
It's not reasonable to ask for a doubling of investments just in this one budget, especially where we are, the way the economy is placed right now. That's not a reasonable ask. But what is very reasonable is to ask for a smart, is definitely to ask for more, but also to ask for a smarter use of money. We Indians are known for our jugaad, which is a terrible word, I admit, but we are known for our frugal engineering. And there are ways and means of ensuring excellent learning outcomes using frugal engineering tools. In fact, Parth himself supports, and CCS supports, an organization called NISA, which works with budget private schools, and there you have a very committed base of schools that ensure low cost and low priced learning to people. It's possible. Government measures as well. You look at some of the NCERT teacher training textbooks. The materials exist. Some of the research exists for very low cost, very interesting STEM level training. So
so it doesn't really cost much to educate the country. It's just about the right kind of schemes and the right kind of reforms and the right kind of announcements and programs that the government really brings in that would
very
help
importantly
education.
the right kind of connects between the programs.
Sure. I'm going to go over to Parth now. Parth, we often boast about high enrollment ratios in primary sector and quality tertiary institutes in terms of the IITs and the IIMs, which we're always talking about. But we often forget about our secondary sector, as maximum dropouts really happen at that stage, and research really backs that information. What do you think about that?
Sorry, I missed part of your question. You were saying something about IITs.
I was talking
on.
about how we really keep talking about high enrollment ratios in the primary sector primarily. We're also talking about quality tertiary institutions. That's when I brought up IITs and IIMs really. But what we are often forgetting is our secondary sector. You know, we've noticed that there have been maximum amount of dropouts that are happening at that stage. What do you think about that? How do you think we can put a pause to that?
I think one key challenge, as you rightly pointed out, is not just the enrollment, but quality of education that we are able to provide. What we learn in our experience and some of the programs that we have run is that when you give people a choice of a school, as opposed to making them feel that there's only one place for them to go, then you find that choice element increases their engagement with education of the child, of the parents, and also accountability towards the school. We also find, obviously, the school becomes more accountable to parents for delivery of learning. And so I think choice, in our experience, has been one key tool that allows both parties, parents on one hand, who certainly have other things to worry about in their life than just the education of their children, but also equally the schools themselves, making them accountable to parents, right? So today, if you look at at least government schools, they're accountable to government education department, but not to the parents, not to the students who are coming to those schools, right? And by giving them parents a choice, and one way to do the choice is through a school voucher program. The 25% seats in private schools under the RTE is part of that voucher program, but that covers a very small proportion actually of the poor who want to go to private school. So one way I think is to increase competition between private schools and public schools, and to some extent also across government schools. Right? So both of those are going to be very useful ways in which we could improve the quality. Right? For IITs, I think it's quite easy to see that if you select very small proportion of large number of students who apply, they are genius by selection. No matter what you do to them, they are going to be very successful in life by and large, right? So it's not so much about the quality of IIT education.
No, you're right about the IIT bit. For a student to be able to make it first to the IIT, we need a larger base of secondary school students and a primary school students. And that, you see, the base is not that large, really. The ones from the more affluent classes are being able to make it to higher education and, of course, skill-based education like the IITs and AIMs. I'm talking about the larger base of primary education, which is more like a right of every civilian today in this country.
Yes, very much true. I think that's where the focus on quality is most important. Unfortunately, so far, the public policy debate and the government action has been focused so much on building schools, hiring teachers, training teachers, without asking the question about what happens at the end of it all, right? So I think quality, part of quality, as I mentioned, is accountability. Schools being accountable to parents, not just only to education departments. Also, part of the challenge is that our school recognition norms for, say, private schools are skewed towards inputs. We don't judge schools by their outcomes. Neither private schools, obviously not government schools. So we need to have a uniform regulatory system in which both private schools and government schools are treated equally, held equally to account for their performance, particularly in learning outcomes, as opposed to what salaries they pay to teachers, how big the school buildings are, and how large the library is. Right? So I think that's one larger set of reforms that we need. Secondly, I think we have argued that we need to separate the role of regulator from the delivery provider. So department that provides and runs government schools should not also be a regulator of education in general, just like what we have done in Delhi.
Right. I think we've lost the video to Parth. We're going to bring him in just about a bit. In the meanwhile now, it's very interesting that we'd like to share with our viewers the lack of optimal utilization of resources allocated during budget has a direct bearing on the household expenses of people. Our correspondent Kandar Rastogi brings you the story. Take a look and we'll come back to Parth.
Works as a domestic helper in Delhi. She's a single parent who earns around 8,000 rupees each month. Despite the limited income, she has chosen to send her son to a private school instead of a government school.
Kids in my locality going to government schools cannot read or speak English. My son can do both. I spend 3,000 rupees on his school fees and an additional 500 to 600 on transportation every month. I am the sole breadwinner of the house, but his education is my topmost priority.
Geeta's story is not unique. A number of parents like her are easily opting for private schools for their children. Data from the District Information System for Education shows that between 2007 and 2013, enrollment in government schools declined by about 11.7 million. In contrast, enrollment in private schools went up by 27 million. The decline in enrollment is a worrying trend. This is more so given that it has happened despite a consistent increase in expenditure on government schools over the same period. One of the big reasons for parents making the switch from public to private schools is the poor learning levels reported by government schools. When I used to go to a government school, half the students would just mark their attendance and leave. We never had any activities and nobody even bothered to check our homework. But in my present school, we have to wear proper uniforms, and upon not completing our homework, we get punished. According to the Annual Status of Education Report 2014 by Pratham, an NGO working towards improving the quality of education in India, only 46.8% students in the 8th standard could read simple sentences in English. This data reflects learning levels across schools in India, whether government or private. Clearly, therefore, it is not necessary that being in a private school in itself implies higher quality of education.
So, in UP...
But experts like Prashant Narang say that often government funding to schools is not well rationalized.
There are fewer students. So, for example, there was a news yesterday that in one of the schools in Lahaul Spiti has just one student in the entire school, and the government spending on that school is 13 lakh rupees. ASER has clearly shown that there is a huge gap in learning outcomes as far as government schools and private schools are concerned.
But enrollment in private schools means increased spending for families. According to a recent study by the Associated Chambers of Commerce in India, school expenses of a single child including tuition fees have risen from Rs 55,000 in 2005 to Rs 1,25,000 per annum in 2015. In addition, a report by the National Sample Survey Office shows that as of 2015, 1 out of every 4 students in India took private tuitions, with parents spending an average of Rs 2,000 per year for these classes. All of this places additional burden on poorer families. Despite that, until public schools can get their act together, there is a little choice for parents like Geeta if they are looking for a better future for their children. In New Delhi, this is Kandar Prustagi for WION.
So I'm going to come to Meeta in the studio now. We just took a look at that story as well. Kandarp has very well elaborated how really the public schools are not doing their bit. The quality of teachers is pathetic to say the least, and this is what is making parents move their kids from public schools to private schools. Now, when you go to a private school, you have a direct impact on your household budget as well because you're spending more. At the same time, when the quality of teachers is pathetic, what you're trying to do is there's a parallel tuition industry which is growing in India as well. Again, another big pressure on your wallet as well for most parents who are sending their kids to school. How are we addressing these issues? How do you think we need to up the level of public schools in India? How do we get better teachers in? That also means you have to hire the better talent, and better talent means spending more on your teachers as well. You think the budget going forward is going to be addressing all of this?
It's interesting you say that more money spent on teachers is going to result in better teachers. Well, we tried that in the 6th Pay Commission, and teacher pay, especially in the government sector, is actually a very, very respectable amount. A starting salary is about 30,000 and an average salary is about 50,000 per month. And that's a respectable salary.
Is that we're talking about the public sector?
We're talking about the public sector.
Okay.
It's a respectable salary, and we did meet that. The mistake we made at that time as a nation was to simply up the expenditure without adding any accountability norms or quality norms to that. And while that mistake was made, I think it was a good idea to respect the work that teachers have done. The other thing that I dispute here is the quality of teachers. The quality of teachers as far as their qualifications and certification goes is again excellent, probably better in the public sector, in the government sector, than in the private sector. In fact, one of the complaints against the private sector is that their teachers are not qualified at all, nor are they well paid. Yet the private sector manages to make sure that there are teachers in class attending to student needs all the time. And this is where it gets interesting, because it is the delivery of education, or what actually happens in the classroom, that is of far greater value than what you spend on it. So it's not just what you spend on it, but what you use it for. That is very important. And I think that is where we are in education right now, saying we need to spend more on the right things, but not necessarily on everything.
So you're trying to say even the municipal schools that you see where you really don't pay a fee to go there, those teachers are also up to the mark compared to the private institutions?
Now, what do we mean by up to the mark? First, there are 2 or 3 things.
On par with the private schools is what I mean.
On par with the private schools, because they have certain qualifications that they must present when they are called to interview. that you cannot be selected in a government job without having a certain set of qualifications. Now, whether that certificate is worth that paper it's written on is a whole other set, and again falls back on the education sector. So that's a whole other can of worms that we won't open here in this particular discussion. But it is true that they are certainly well qualified. Now, are they trained well enough? Do they actually know how to teach? I could actually know something really well, but I might be the worst teacher. I mean, I discovered that myself.
That's where the gap really lies between, there's always a distance between the cup and the lip. So while you are qualified, you may not be the best teacher available.
And you may not actually be suited to that particular pathway, and which is why a couple of things that really need to change radically in this sector is, one, we need to allow for lifelong learning. You were talking about secondary school dropouts. Everybody knows that social mobility and economic mobility, especially in India, it's proven far more than in any other country, improves dramatically with education, and yet you have students dropping out. Why? I have no idea. I cannot fathom why we do not give them a second chance via community colleges or via creating lifelong learning opportunities in place. The other radical change that we need to make is we need to make sure that teachers themselves have pathways into even the tenured ones. And half of the problem is with tenure. You have a permanent job, you have no incentive to do better. But the ones who are really good and really well trained may want to do something different. They may want to mentor other teachers. They may be tired of actually plowing their way through the classroom. They may want to become leaders in the classroom. Teacher pathways have received very little investment so far, and this is one of the things that I hope the budget
that's where the finance minister needs to this time around focus on, if they really want to bring any kind of a radical change really in the education system. Otherwise, we're just going on and on and on. It's a loop that continues, and we're not being able to be disruptive, like you rightly mentioned at the start of the show as well. You know, I'm going to get closing comments now from Parth. Parth, according to a UN Water 2008 study in the Alwar district, school sanitation increased girls' enrollment by 1/3 and improved academic performance of boys and girls by 25%. We have such low-hanging fruits, and yet we are lagging. What are your comments on this and your closing thoughts on that front?
Much of the issues of infrastructure are not really now issues of money. They are largely issues of execution. It's not that we don't have money to build toilets in our schools. We have enough money to do that. Problem is actually executing and also changing some of the behavior patterns, right? And those two, I think, are the really good focus for the government to do. I think in terms of financial allocation, I should point out that the private sector also spends large chunks of money. So if you add up what we spend as a household level and what government spends, is about 3.5% of GDP. Households spend about 1.5% of GDP. So that combined is about 5% of GDP that we already spend on education. So my sense is it's not so much about the quantum of money. Of course, you can always use more money, there's no doubt. But it's how we spend that money. What are we getting in exchange for that money? What is the value of that money that is being delivered? I think that's a far more important question.
Sure.
It's not just purely about the budget, but how the budget is expended. Where is budget spent and how the accountability of that spending is being maintained. I think if you can address that issue, then even 5% of GDP that we have could go a long, long way.
Thank you so much for those closing comments, Parth, and thank you so much, Meeta, as well, for joining us right here in the studio on this particular discussion on the education sector. I'd like to thank both our panelists for joining us right here to discuss the education sector in much detail.